this is your host, Julia Napini. I am a clinical and forensic social worker who owns a counseling practice and a consulting business. In this show, we discuss the challenges of being successful in business while maintaining your integrity and staying true to yourself. Join me while I interview other professionals and share insights from life and experience. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Compassionate Climb Podcast. I'm your host, Julia Napini, and I am here today with a dear friend, Josh Frias, and we have known each other for a long time. He is somebody that embodies integrity, so it wasn't even a question to have him on here to learn a little bit more about his climb, share that with all of you, and how he maintains that core value throughout his journey. So welcome, Josh.
Thanks, Julia. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be joining you this morning.
Absolutely. So I genuinely enjoy these conversations, and it's such a treat when I can bring someone from my own life into this and share some of the conversations that we've had, but with more people, a wider audience. So can you introduce yourself for the audience? Tell us what you do and a little bit about your life.
Sure. So my name is Josh Frias. I'm a physician assistant who has worked in head and neck surgery for about the last 14 years. And so I'm also a Massachusetts and Rhode Island licensed realtor and owner of Josh Frias Properties, which currently operates as a DBA in affiliation with a local independent real estate brokerage based out of Fall River. I'm also a husband to my beautiful and incredibly supportive wife, Rebecca, and father to my two wonderful children, Connor and Nora. I would say that my journey likely began in the second half of my college career. I had made a decision around that time that I wanted to pursue a career in medicine. And after spending a lot of time with people in the profession and exploring options of med school, PA school, and nursing, the idea of becoming a PA checked most of the boxes for me, as far as the boxes I was hoping to check off career-wise. And so that's what I did. I spent 2 years training in Manhattan at Cornell's Graduate School of Medical Sciences. At that time, the PA school was pretty much operating somewhat parallel with the med school. We shared a lot of classes and clinical rotations that were taught by some really brilliant physician and mid-level instructors. And so I was really fortunate to have been given the opportunity to spend time with and learn from people who were way smarter than I was. Also at the time, Rebecca had somewhat willingly in a way, but in some respects reluctantly agreed to move out to New York City with me and completed her master's in social work at Columbia during the time that we were out there. Ultimately, we moved back to South Coast area of Massachusetts because we knew we wanted to stay close to family and eventually start our own family. And so that's what we did. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, a little bit of kind of fast forwarding a bit, I worked the next several years exclusively as a PA and loved it. And I still love it. I work with great people, and I've been blessed, up to this point with the opportunity to have helped people in some pretty remarkable ways. But I've always had an interest in starting a business. And with how healthcare has evolved over the last 10 to 15 years, and I think you can probably relate to this. It's been challenging to try and build a medicine-based business as a non-physician among what are now, giants within the healthcare industry. Mm-hmm. So I thought, what are my other interests and what could I see myself doing? And so I've always had an interest in architecture and real estate, and I've always been fascinated by the economics of the real estate industry. The swings and shifts that you see over time and all of that. And so I decided I would just go for it. And it's been so much fun learning a new process and learning new skills and being able to take a lot of the skills that I've learned over the years in one line of work and carrying them over into a new line of work. It's been a great learning experience, and I've met so many people, so many great people along the way.
what are some of the skills that you find are transferable? Because I think at the outset, I'm thinking two very different worlds.
Yeah. So, and you're absolutely right. So there's someone I work with who, when I had the conversation with her, she had lots of questions for me about real estate versus healthcare. And she's like, this is like very much a colliding of two different worlds. And I was like, yeah, I guess it is. And she was so right at the time. And I didn't even realize how right she was, but over time kind of figured out that it was. So it's so different, but I find that you do develop so many skills that are transferable, and some of them are just, being very transparent and being very honest, and being very, very eloquent with words and sensitive with words, but deliberate, and just always, making sure to, always coming from a good place.
So it sounds like in your role as a PA, I'm sure there are times when you might have to deliver some unfortunate news. You're dealing with people potentially at a vulnerable time. And then I'm sure you've also had experience just kind of with like bedside manner and helping people to feel comfortable. So I can see how that piece is transferable for sure. How did you find the business side? Was that completely new to you? Did you feel like you had early experiences that kind of helped prepare you for that? Or has it been a total learning curve?
I would have to say it's been a total learning curve. And I would say the main reason is because in healthcare, you serve as a humanitarian, right? And people see you that way, right? They don't have to know you, but on their first experience with you, they trust you, they're open with you, and there's very little, if any, guard that is up, right?
Yes.
On the other side, you are not a humanitarian. You are what's perceived as a salesman, right? And so you can kind of imagine what a first-time encounter is with, say, your doctor or your PA, your nurse practitioner, versus what your first-time encounter would be with a salesman. Very different. Like,
right.
Your guard is up. Your body language is different. You just have so many reservations that you wouldn't when you compare it to going to see a healthcare provider. And so when you are in a healthcare provider role for so many years, I think it's fair to say that you almost become naive to everything else that exists, right? Because you know that you're coming from a good place.
Right.
But you're in an industry where so many people are not.
And you have to prove yourself.
Some people are not, and you absolutely have to prove yourself. So you wonder why people sometimes are not as receptive, and it's because naturally you are not in the same role as a real estate professional as you are as a healthcare professional. They are very, very different. And so you have to prove yourself.
Well, and I'm assuming you've probably had both types of experiences where with some people, maybe you get to that point of trust quicker, and others where it's more challenging. And I'm sure it gets easier with time and easier with practice. And the more you build that business and that reputation and those relationships, it will come. But how have you persevered in those times when it's been really hard, where something that almost came more naturally and authentically is something that now takes more work?
Yeah. So I think you made a great point there. Relationships are huge. If you go to see a healthcare provider, you can basically on the first go have a conversation that sounds like you've known a person forever. As a business owner or a professional not in the healthcare industry, it takes a lot more work. You have to work at building the relationship. You have to prove to the person that you are trustworthy, and you want to you want to put yourself in a position where you're providing value, and you're saying, hey, you know what? This is what I'm offering, and it's very much a sales, or it's taught as very much a sales profession. But I've tried to change my style of doing things in a way that does not come off as a sales-driven type of attitude or angle. And I feel like that has been really good, and really people have been receptive to that, because it's just not pushy and salesy. It's coming from a place of value and good intention. And even despite that, it still takes time, because you have to kind of cross or get over that hump of a little bit of hesitation, if that makes sense.
It does. And I can also see situations where the timing piece is huge, because a lot of that trust gets built when someone reaches out to you beyond that initial encounter, and they need something, or they have a question, and that responsiveness, that follow through, that linking them to what they need and making sure that things get done. And so I'm sure that that's a piece that really helps to enhance those relationships, but it takes a lot of patience, I'm sure. And one theme that comes out a lot in these interviews that I've noticed is we're not for everyone. And I'm wondering if you can speak on that piece, where that kind of acceptance and maybe the one realm of your life early on and then what you're doing now could be a real contrast of kind of accepting that harsh reality that someone may ultimately decide not to utilize your services, despite everything you're saying that you do to set yourself apart. How do you handle that?
Yeah. And so you're totally right with that. With the healthcare industry, it is essential. I mean, let's be honest. Healthcare is a business, right? And I feel like it has become one now more than ever. But it's a business where it is an inbound service business. And what I mean by that is people seek you out for advice, help, treatment, right? And you're providing a service to them. At a high level, real estate is an outbound sales an outbound sales position, or outbound sales business. And so it's kind of flipped in that people, although sometimes people will come to you, the majority of the time you spend, especially early on, seeking them out, trying to provide what you consider a service to them, but it may be a service that they have zero interest in taking advantage of at that time.
Right.
And that's really the case early on, at least it was for me, in prospecting and trying to develop relationships with essentially strangers, because nurturing relationships with family and friends who know that you have come into the industry is easy.
Right.
Trying to build relationships with strangers who see you as a salesman is a lot harder.
So knowing more about your journey, obviously I can see that those qualities are there to ultimately get to that place. And it sounds like you've already had success with building those relationships, persevering, accepting that we're not for everyone and that's okay. How do you balance it all? So the family life and the primary career and then this business, do you have any tips around that? And tell us what that's been like.
So nothing is done alone. And
it takes a village.
It absolutely does. Yeah. It is a balance. And I'm sure you can speak to this too. You never thought you could be so efficient with your time when you start to fill it with so many things.
Right.
And it's a great skill that over time you learn, whether or not you know that you're learning it. And I have to say that I attribute a lot of the things that I've been able to do over the last 3-4 years to the support of my wife. I mean, she is what keeps, things moving. She is basically the cogs that keep things cranking. Because there are only so many hours in a day, and you try to maximize the time you spend with your primary work, any business venture, and also your family. And especially if you have school-age children, that time is so valuable. You don't get it back. And so, we try to, it's difficult to balance, but it's important to balance and not have it be heavily weighted one versus the other.
Yeah. So it sounds like the balance for you really starts in that relationship and being comfortable asking for help and working as a team. And that I'm assuming you both have this common goal in mind that you're working towards. And so, there are times when you're both kind of doing that on your own ventures and then kind of coming back together. And I can obviously speak to that because she's a huge supporter of mine, and I see her and how she juggles as well. And I also see the two of you really complementing each other because you both kind of have different skill sets and approach things in different ways. And it's this really beautiful blend. So I stand back in awe of the two of you very often. So that's really good advice. So integrity, we've kind of alluded to that throughout this conversation. What would your definition of integrity be?
Yeah. So for me, integrity means being consistently honest with yourself and the people that you serve. I would say don't change who you are to fit what you're trying to do. I think that if people follow that principle, then you'll always kind of you'll always be in a good place. And I think it's important to check in with yourself often and be like, what am I doing? And what is the motivation for what am I doing? And what is the motivation for what I'm doing? Why am I doing this? And am I taking the steps that I need to and going about them in the right way?
So I am assuming that has come with time. I can definitely think about earlier times in my own life where that was not so clear. And I think also knowing how we're raising our children, what advice would you have for someone that is struggling with that? Because again, I think that it really comes through experience and aging and maturing and having people around you that really are there supporting you no matter what. But we may not always feel that in earlier stages of our lives. So how have you gotten to that point and how do you maintain that when it's hard? And any advice for someone struggling with that?
I think that it's important to kind of stay true to your core values,
So knowing what they are, definitely step one for sure. I think that takes some reflection. I also would say it takes experiences where you kind of draw those out. So something happens and it's not in alignment and it doesn't feel right, and having conversations with the people in your circle or thinking, why is it that I'm feeling the way that I do about this? Why am I struggling to sleep or it's still on my mind? So knowing your core values for sure. What else would you say? Being in alignment, how do you personally know when something's out of alignment with your values? Yeah,
so Rebecca and I, we we say it just feels icky.
Yes.
Right. It's just kind of this, this sixth sense, right? Where you say this just doesn't feel right. And so in healthcare, that's always been easy. It's always been easy to kind of feel good about what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Because again, your intentions are always good. They're always pure. You're coming from a good place. And in other industries, it's especially sales industries.
Yeah.
It's easy to find yourself, even if you don't put yourself in that situation. It's sometimes easy to find yourself in a situation where you're like, "Ooh, this is an icky situation." How did we get into this? What's a good way to navigate away from this and into a better place? And again, constantly reminding yourself of what the right thing is in a given situation, even if it's going to come at, say disappointment to someone else, a client or whatever, or into a loss on your own, a loss of your own, right? I mean, you could say or do something where you're like, you know what? I'm going to completely lose out on this transaction and completely have to abandon this relationship, but it's the right thing to do because although I'm coming from a good place, this person is not, and it's going to end badly. So.
One of the questions that I often ask is a challenge, and it sounds like you're alluding to that, maybe a theme there of situations where you find that you're not in alignment with someone else that you're having some sort of a transaction with. What are some ways that you have still stayed true to who you are, but respectfully kind of bowed out in a situation like that?
Yeah, I think it's important, and that's a great question. I think it's important to keep an open mind. Try to see the perspective of the person that you may have a potential conflict with.
Yes.
And be able to offer options, right? Options that will hopefully serve the person in conflict to some degree.
Sure.
But at the same time, you're not going to completely abandon your own values, right? And that can be hard. And sometimes you can come to a meeting point on that, and sometimes you can't, right?
So one of the things you spoke to there was true empathy, which can be so challenging, especially when it is your business and when there is that potential of losing out on whether it be income or a relationship or some sort of a partnership. But I think that whole perspective shift and taking a moment and considering where the other person is coming from can be invaluable and is not always easy to do. I don't think it comes naturally necessarily when we're trying to preserve ourselves. So I appreciate you making reference to that. And then it sounds like giving people options, that we all have choices. We are not stuck. We are not cornered. There are plenty of other professionals out there that they could seek out. So it sounds like you give them choices, which is also really helpful. So in summation, what is one major takeaway that you would hope that those listening would still be thinking about and letting marinate when they're no longer listening to the episode today?
Yeah. So, I think that a lot of people are afraid of failing. Okay. And I try to view the idea as almost non-existent, like failure does not exist, right? View it not as failure, but as an opportunity to either grow or learn, right? If you take something on, it's normal to feel, worried, scared, whatever, but do it, go for it. And if it works out, then you'll experience some level of growth from it. If it doesn't work out, then you will learn from it. Right. And find a way to pivot and do something else with it or do something else completely. But don't abandon the idea of doing something because you just don't know if it's going to work out.
I couldn't agree more. And what you're speaking to is ultimately is something defined as a failure if you can ultimately have some sort of a takeaway, draw some meaning from it, get some increased self-awareness, pivot, do something different. I would ultimately say that is exactly what makes it successful and not ultimately a failure. So that's a great takeaway. So if those that are listening want to seek you out, if they ultimately are looking for property or want to learn more about what you do, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah. So The best way to do that would probably be just by email. The work email is simply jf@joshfriasrealestate.com. And yeah, I mean, if it's something that people have questions about or whatever, I'm happy to talk with them.
Thank you for sharing that. I'll definitely include that in the show notes today. And I cannot thank you enough for your time today, for your contribution to the medical field that is very lucky to have you. Now the real estate market, and obviously knowing the example that you are obviously setting for your children and the remarkable team you have with your spouse is a true inspiration. So thanks for being here today. I appreciate it, Josh.
Thank you for having me, Julia. It's been a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
If you like what you're hearing, please rate and review. This will help others find us and benefit as well. The Compassionate Climb podcast represents the opinions of Julia Napini and her guests. The information provided is intended for educational purposes only and should not be taken as legal advice. If that is what you are seeking, please consult an attorney.